I'm Janice Switlo, and in my previous episode, Canada's Genocidal Justice, I point out the history of this intentional strategy to use judges, the courts, to imprison, in fact, even attempt to do so prior to any allegations or any evidence of any wrongdoing whatsoever, just on the basis of the, quote, nature of the man, end of quote, and the fact of being perceived as being troublesome because they were too strong an Indigenous national intent on helping and preserving their people. So that was a previous episode, and I'm going to move on and just caution that there's a lot underway in terms of criticism of justice systems, in particular generating from the United States of America in terms of the issues going on for Black people there. And there's a term that I'm seeing used a lot, seems to be coming more out of academic quarters, initials used to convey a certain perspective easily, and that is BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, Persons of Color, in terms of referencing the various issues that are going on. And I really need to caution that this can be dangerous for Indigenous nationals. Why? Because that's a grouping of domestic ethnic minorities. That's a grouping with people who do not have original title, original lands in the subject areas where it's being applied. I object to the inclusion of it. Now, in some parts of the world, yes, that may make sense, where the Indigenous population are indeed domestic ethnic minorities. And indeed, there even are certain areas of Canada where that could be said to be true. However, for the vast majority, where there are still Indigenous nations, where there are still treaties with the Crown, to lower the perception and grouping of Indigenous nationals into BIPOC proves problematic, because of course Canada's great effort is to indeed create a class of domestic ethnic minority of those people who are descended from Indigenous people who were seen as less than people and less developed than other humans in the world at the time under the doctrine of discovery. So it's a not so minor effect when you look at Indigenous people wanting to compare the long-term genocidal justice system that's still being applied to them and seeing relations in the States, if you will, dealing with the very same issues. It's easy for Canadians as a whole, Indigenous nationals, to kind of jump in and start using terminology. And as I said, it's very important not to be embracing terms and things like BIPOC as a convenient means. It's important, if pursuing these kinds of issues, to be clear as to who you are, or you end up damaging yourselves even more by appearing to agree that you are just like all the other people in terms of what that acronym embraces. So I want to point out, there was an Indigenous chief, Alan Adam, of the Athabascan Chipewyan First Nation, that everyone has read about in the news, when he was arrested in front of a casino and how he was handled and how that situation went. I'm not passing comment on all of that, but I do want to point out that in a situation where he's drawing attention to allegations of police brutality, for example, an opportunity to express that this is a continuing problem in Canada for Indigenous nationals of Indigenous nations, instead of speaking in that way, here's what he said, and is quoted in the Globe and Mail on Saturday, June 6, 2020. Chief Adams said, quote, "We need an overhaul of our justice system in regard to how it treats minority people. There is systemic racism," he said. "It is normal for any officer who carries a badge and a sidearm to shoot or beat someone of a different minority and say, 'We'll deal with them this way. He's just a Native person who is worthless, a drunk.'" To describe himself as just another domestic ethnic minority is to do just as much harm as what he is pointing to and saying he's just a Native person who's worthless and a drunk. it undermines the very legal reality that he's actually an Indigenous national of an Indigenous nation that forms the foundation of Canada. To relegate himself to that lowest rung as a domestic ethnic minority is really tragic and most unfortunate. Here was an opportunity where he could have emphasized, and again, I'm not passing judgment on either he or the police involved, etc. I just want to point to and stick to this issue that whenever you're speaking and becoming public, it's imperative to be accurate as to who you are. But clearly, he sees himself as a domestic ethnic minority. Who is teaching this kind of language? Well, it's everywhere, quite frankly. It's not unexpected to read this. It's disarming, it's disappointing, but it's not unexpected. So I wanted to really point that out, that always have under your belt, ready to roll, a clear description of who you are. That pays honor to your ancestors and to future generations. And that's all I have to say.